History hides its greatest adventures in the spaces between the maps. We are about to meet 30 people who stepped directly into those blank spaces. These were the medieval explorers, and their true stories are woven from equal parts fact, legend, and enduring mystery. By the end of this journey, you will possess a complete panorama of the medieval world as it was truly discovered, from the inside out. You will learn why a Chinese monk stood in the heart of medieval Europe, and how a mythical Christian king shaped real voyages for centuries. What single quality do you believe all these daring souls shared? Our story begins not with a ship's captain, but with a scholar on a diplomatic mission. In the early 10th century, the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad received an unusual request for help. A distant king of the Volga Bulgars, recently converted to Islam, wanted guidance on religious law and funds to build a fortress. The Caliph sent back a delegation led by a secretary named Ahmad ibn Fadlan. His official task was mundane, but the journey he recorded became one of history's most extraordinary windows into a hidden world. Ibn Fadlan's caravan traveled for months, moving north and east from the heart of the Islamic Empire into the vast, cold steppes near the Volga River. His account is not a dry report. It is the astonished, sometimes appalled, observations of a cultured man from a sophisticated urban center confronting the raw, vigorous customs of the frontier. And it was there at the edge of the known world that he encountered the ruse. These were not the Vikings of later romantic sagas. Ibn Fadlan describes them as tall, tattooed, and fiercely physical traders from the north. He details their daily life with an anthropologist's sigh, noting their perfect physiques, their constant state of commerce, and their shocking lack of modesty by his standards. He watched their rituals, their bargaining, and their intense personal cleanliness, which contrasted sharply with other habits he found baffling. But one observation towers above all others in its chilling detail. Ibn Fadlan was present for and meticulously documented the funeral of a ruse chieftain. He describes the solemn, days-long process, the selection of a slave girl to accompany her master to the afterlife, and the final, terrifying ceremony aboard a beach ship. His unflinching account of the ritual sacrifice and the blazing pyre is so vivid, it feels less like reading history and more like witnessing a haunting, thousand-year-old film. This single document provides something almost non-existent from this era, a first-hand, outsider's perspective on a people who wrote little down about themselves. Through Ibn Fadlan's disbelieving eyes, the legend of the Vikings gains a startling human dimension. He did not set out to explore unknown lands, yet he became one of history's greatest explorers of the human condition, capturing a fleeting moment where two vastly different worlds briefly collided on a riverbank. Ibn Fadlan's world was one of stark cultural frontiers, but just over 2 centuries later, another traveler would map a different kind of geography entirely. He was a rabbi from the small town of Tudela in the Kingdom of Navarre, and his name was Benjamin. Starting around the year 1160, Benjamin embarked on a staggering 13-year journey that would take him from the heart of Europe to the distant edges of Asia. He left behind a record called the Itinerary of Benjamin of Tudela, and it is not merely a travelogue. It is a meticulous census, a commercial report, and a portrait of a thriving, interconnected Jewish world that most history books simply overlook. Benjamin's route was the spine of the medieval world. He traveled from his home in Spain, through the vibrant ports of southern France and Italy, across the sea to Greece, and then into the vast domains of the Byzantine Empire. His ultimate destination was the legendary city of Baghdad, then the intellectual and political capital of the Islamic world, but his true mission seemed to be the people he met along the way. In every city from Rome to Constantinople, from Damascus to Baghdad, Benjamin sought out the local Jewish community. He counted them, he recorded their leaders, their professions, and their economic conditions. He noted if they lived in peace or under restriction. In Constantinople, he marveled at the grandeur of the Hagia Sophia and estimated the city's immense Jewish population of 2,500. In Baghdad, he described the court of the Caliph and the powerful position of the Exarch, the leader of the Jewish diaspora in the East. His writings give us an unprecedented snapshot. We learn about the silk dyers of Thebes, the merchants of Alexandria, and the scholars of Babylon. He describes trade goods, local customs, and political intrigues with a merchant's eye for detail and a scholar's thirst for accuracy. Yet for all the wealth of information, Benjamin himself remains a shadowy figure. The great mystery that surrounds his itinerary is a simple question: why? Was he a merchant scouting trade routes, a pilgrim on a grand scale, a diplomat on a secret mission? The funding for such a long and costly journey is never explained. His quiet, observant tone reveals no obvious agenda beyond the act of witnessing and recording itself. This is what makes his work so vital. In an age often defined by religious conflict, Benjamin of Tudela moved through Muslim and Christian lands not as a conqueror or a crusader, but as a connector. He mapped a world not of kingdoms and armies, but of communities and connections. His itinerary is a reminder that even in the Middle Ages, the world was woven together by threads of commerce, faith, and shared human curiosity. He gives voice to a diaspora, documenting its resilience and its networks at a time when few others bothered to look. So while we may never know exactly who sent him or why he went, we are left with a priceless gift, a street-level view of a global community thriving in the spaces between empires. The meticulous census of Benjamin of Tudela reveals a world connected by faith and trade, but it was the promise of unimaginable wealth that would ultimately capture the European imagination. This brings us to the name that has become synonymous with medieval exploration itself, Marco Polo. For centuries, his story was the ultimate adventure tale, a Venetian merchant who, alongside his father and uncle, traversed the entire Silk Road to reach the magnificent court of Kublai Khan in the Yuan dynasty of China. He claimed to have spent 17 years in the service of the great Khan, traveling on official missions to distant corners of Asia that no European had ever seen. His book, known as The Travels of Marco Polo, became a medieval bestseller, filled with descriptions of cities of staggering splendor, advanced technologies, and customs that seemed lifted from a dream. He wrote of black stones that burned, which we know as coal. He described a form of currency made from the bark of trees, which was paper money. He told of a postal system so efficient it could move messages across thousands of miles in days. To the people of 13th century Europe, these accounts did not sound like reports from a real empire. They sounded like the fantasies of a fable, a description of paradise on earth. And that is the great enduring mystery that has shadowed Marco Polo's legacy for 700 years. Did he truly go to China, or was he, as some skeptics have argued for generations, a brilliant fraud, a man who never went further than a trading post on the Black Sea, weaving together stories he heard from other travelers into a single first-person epic? The controversy is fascinating because both sides present compelling evidence. Critics point to glaring omissions in his text. He never mentions the Great Wall, though its most famous sections were built later. He fails to describe the practice of foot binding, which would have been a shocking sight to a foreigner. He does not write about Chinese tea, a cornerstone of their culture. These absences seem strange for such an observant traveler. Furthermore, his name does not appear in any surviving Chinese or Mongol records of the period, a silence that many find deeply suspicious. Supporters, however, counter with the sheer volume of accurate, specific detail that would have been nearly impossible to fabricate. His descriptions of the layout of Khanbalik, the Mongol capital that would become Beijing, are precise. His accounts of the Yuan dynasty's administration, the use of paper currency, and the grandeur of the imperial court align with what we know from Asian sources. He provides details about regional geography, local products like asbestos cloth, and even the Mongolian practice of using dried milk as a provision, details that were simply not available in European libraries at the time. Perhaps the most compelling argument for his truthfulness is the book's own origin story. Marco Polo did not write it himself. He was captured during a war between Venice and Genoa and imprisoned. To pass the time, he dictated his stories to a fellow prisoner, a writer of popular romances named Rustichello of Pisa. This fact is crucial. It means we are not reading Marco Polo's unvarnished journal. We are reading his memories, filtered through the literary style, and perhaps the embellishments of a professional storyteller aiming to entertain a medieval audience. This collaboration could explain both the book's incredible vividness and its occasional errors or omissions. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle of this century's old debate. Marco Polo probably did travel to the court of Kublai Khan, but his account is not a flawless historical document. It is a memory shaped by time, translated through another man's pen, and designed to astound. Yet, regardless of its absolute accuracy, the impact of the travels of Marco Polo is undeniable and immense. It placed a vision of a sophisticated, unbelievably wealthy East firmly into the European consciousness. His book became a foundational text for future explorers, including a man named Christopher Columbus, who would carry a heavily annotated copy of Polo's travels on his own voyages west, hoping to find a new route to those legendary lands of Cathay. So was Marco Polo a truthful explorer or a masterful storyteller? He may have been the perfect combination of both, a man whose personal narrative, whether fully precise or partially polished, ultimately redrew the map of the possible for an entire continent. The debate over Marco Polo's truthfulness hinges on the unsettling power of what is missing. His silence on the Great Wall is the most famous objection, yet historians note that the monumental stone fortifications we picture today were largely a Ming Dynasty project, built centuries after Polo's visit. The Mongol rulers he served had conquered the wall, not maintained it, so its prominence in the landscape may have been far less. The absence of foot binding and tea is more puzzling, but not definitive. Polo moved primarily in Mongol, not Han Chinese circles. The customs of the conquered population might not have been noteworthy to his patrons, or perhaps Rustichello, his writer, simply edited out details he found irrelevant for a European audience. These gaps are like shadows in an otherwise brilliantly lit painting. They make us question the source of the light, but they do not erase the image entirely. What cannot be easily dismissed is the sheer weight of correct obscure detail. His description of the Mongol capital's layout, with its 12 gates and precise grid of streets, matches archaeological findings. He accurately describes the use of paper money, down to the seal of the Khan stamped upon it, and the practice of burning black stones for heat. He recounts the Mongolian postal system, the Yam, with its relay stations and fresh horses, in exacting detail. Where would a man supposedly confined to a Black Sea trading post have learned such specific, verifiable facts about the inner workings of an empire 5,000 miles away? The most plausible answer remains the simplest: he was there. His book's creation story adds another layer of complexity. Dictated to a romance writer in a Genos prison, the account was always a collaboration between memory and entertainment. Rustichello's hand might have polished certain tales for dramatic effect, perhaps blending Polo's direct experiences with stories he heard at court. This does not make the work a fraud, but rather a medieval bestseller, a blend of eyewitness report and popular literature. Its true power, however, lay not in its absolute precision, but in its catalytic effect on the European mind. The travels of Marco Polo became a geographical Bible. Cartographers pored over its descriptions for centuries, attempting to place its cities of gold and spice onto their parchment maps. It presented a vision of the East not as a land of monsters, but of immense sophistication and wealth, a prize worth any risk. This vision would directly shape the course of history. Nearly 2 centuries later, a Genos navigator named Christopher Columbus studied a heavily annotated copy of Polo's book. The descriptions of Cathay Cipangu and the endless riches of the Great Khan fueled his obsessive belief that sailing west was the fastest route to these legendary lands. When Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean, he was convinced he had reached the outer islands of the Khan's domain, a monumental misreading driven by Polo's persuasive narrative. In this way, whether every word was true or not, Marco Polo's story quite literally launched 1,000 ships. It expanded the horizon of the possible, trading the medieval fear of the unknown for a burning curiosity about what might be found there. His legacy is the ultimate paradox, a man whose personal truth became woven into a collective dream, a dream that would ultimately redraw the map of the entire world. If Marco Polo's legacy is a debate between truth and tale, the story of his near contemporary from Morocco leaves no room for doubt about the miles traveled. In the year 1325, a 21-year-old legal scholar named Ibn Battuta left his home in Tangier. His plan was simple: a pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca, a journey that should have taken about 16 months. He would not see Morocco again for 24 years. What began as a religious duty spiraled into one of the most astonishing personal odysseys in human history, a 3-decade trek across the entire known Islamic world and far beyond. By the end, this one man had walked, sailed, and ridden a staggering 75,000 miles, a distance equivalent to circling the Earth 3 times. His account, known as the Rihla, or the Journey, is not just a travelogue. It is an encyclopedic portrait of the 14th century world, written by a man who seemed physically incapable of staying put. After completing his first Hajj in Mecca, Ibn Battuta did not turn for home. Instead, he looked at the roads radiating out from the holy city and chose one. He traveled to Iraq and Persia, then down the coast of East Africa as far as modern-day Tanzania. He doubled back to visit Anatolia and the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. He then plunged south across the vast Sahara Desert to the wealthy West African empire of Mali, but his most consequential detour was eastward. Hearing of the lavish court of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, the Sultan of Delhi, Ibn Battuta set his sights on India. After a grueling journey through Afghanistan and over the Hindu Kush mountains, he arrived in Delhi, where his deep knowledge of Islamic law secured him a remarkable position. The mercurial sultan appointed him a qadi, a chief judge, a role of immense prestige and danger in a volatile court. For nearly 8 years, Ibn Battuta navigated the politics of the sultanate, surviving periods of great favor and others where he feared for his life, once fleeing to live as a hermit. His escape from this gilded cage came when the sultan tasked him with leading a diplomatic mission to the Emperor of China. This assignment launched the next chapter of chaos and wonder. His party was attacked by bandits, he was shipwrecked and lost all his possessions, and he was even given up for dead. Yet with relentless perseverance, he pressed on, traveling through the Maldive Islands, where he again served as a judge, and then to Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, and finally to the port of Quanju in China. His observations there are brief but vivid, describing a land of immense wealth, strange customs, and breathtaking ports. What makes the Rihla so invaluable is its granular, human detail. Ibn Battuta was a professional noticer. He recorded the price of goods in the markets of Damascus, the architectural splendor of the mosque in Damascus, the generous hospitality of Turkish tribes, and the unsettling customs he witnessed in the Maldives. He survived desert crossings, pirate attacks, and political intrigue, not as a conqueror or merchant, but as a scholar and legalist, using his wits and his education as his primary currency. His work provides a panoramic street-level view of a vast interconnected world, the Dar al-Islam, or House of Islam, stretching from West Africa to the Pacific. It shows us a medieval globe knitted together by faith, trade routes, and a shared intellectual language, all witnessed through the eyes of a man driven by an insatiable curiosity that simply outweighed any desire to ever go home. The staggering distances covered by Ibn Battuta reveal a world already deeply interconnected, but sometimes the most revealing journeys are the ones that reverse our entire perspective. While Europeans dreamed of reaching the fabled East, a man from the heart of Asia was already knocking on their door. His name was Rabban Bar Sauma, and he was a Nestorian Christian monk born in the city of Kanbalik, what we know today as Beijing. In the late 13th century, this elderly cleric, who had spent most of his life in contemplation, was chosen for an extraordinary and perilous mission. The Mongol ruler of the Ilkhanate in Persia, a Buddhist king named Arghun, sought a military alliance with the Christian kingdoms of Europe against their common enemy, the Muslim Mamluks. Who better to send as an envoy than a Christian from the East? And so, around the year 1287, Bar Sauma, accompanied by a younger monk, set out not for the exotic Orient, but for the familiar homelands of Christendom. His journey was a complete inversion of the travel narratives we expect. He moved from the cosmopolitan capital of the Mongol world, through the ancient cities of Armenia and Georgia, to the bustling port of Constantinople. There he marveled at the Hagia Sophia, a church so vast and beautiful it left him in awe. He then sailed to Italy, landing in Naples, where he witnessed something utterly foreign to him, a naval battle between the fleets of Aragon and the Angevins. His description of the war, galleys clashing, is one of sheer astonishment, a reminder that warfare at sea was a spectacle unknown in his landlocked experience. From there, his path led him to the spiritual centers of Europe. In Rome, he had a long theological discussion with the College of Cardinals following the death of a pope. He detailed the rituals, the debates, and the grandeur of the Vatican with the meticulous eye of an outsider. He then traveled north to the court of King Philip IV of France in Paris. He described the city's university, its vibrant intellectual life, and the king's magnificent palace, particularly the Sainte-Chapelle with its walls of stained glass. His final major audience was with King Edward I of England in Gascony, where he presented letters and gifts and participated in Christian Mass, noting the differences in ritual from his own Nestorian tradition. The profound irony of his mission is palpable. Here was a Chinese-born monk, representing a Mongol ruler, explaining the nuances of Eastern Christianity to the princes and prelates of Europe, all in the hope of forging a grand alliance. His detailed observations are a priceless mirror held up to medieval Europe. He notes their architecture, their fashion, their political intrigues, and their religious practices not as a European would, but as a cultured visitor from another equally sophisticated world. He was neither a conqueror nor a merchant, but a diplomat and a pilgrim, and his account strips away the exoticism usually reserved for the East, applying it instead to the West. The ultimate mystery and tragedy of his mission is its failure. Despite warm receptions and lengthy theological discussions, no concrete military alliance ever materialized. The kings and popes were too embroiled in their own conflicts and perhaps too skeptical of an alliance with a distant Mongol Khan. Bar Sauma returned to Persia without the pact he sought, and the Ilkhanate eventually converted to Islam, closing this brief window of possibility. Yet his journey was far from a footnote. It stands as stunning proof of a world far more fluid and connected than we often assume. A Christian monk from Beijing could walk into the court of the King of England and be understood. His story collapses the simple East-West divide, revealing a medieval globe where identities were complex, loyalties were strategic, and a single man's pilgrimage could embody the hopes and misconnections of entire continents. Bar Sauma's journey proved that corridors of communication existed across continents, but they were fragile, built on fleeting political needs. Just a few decades earlier, another Christian traveler had walked a far more difficult path into the Mongol heartland with a much more ambitious goal. He was not a diplomat seeking an alliance, but a friar on a mission from God. William of Rubruck, a Flemish Franciscan monk, set out in the year 1253 with a directive that seems almost unimaginable in its audacity. He was sent by the devout King Louis IX of France, not just to observe or negotiate, but to convert the Mongol Empire to Christianity. His journey was an exercise in pure endurance. Traveling from the Crusader outpost of Acre in the Holy Land, he moved north through Constantinople and then onto the vast, open sea of grass that was the Eurasian steppe. Unlike the well-equipped caravans of diplomats, Rubruck and his small companion traveled with minimal protection, exposed to the brutal elements and the constant uncertainty of nomadic politics. His account, The Journey of William of Rubruck to the Eastern Parts of the World, reads like a gritty survival log. He describes the piercing cold, the reliance on fermented mare's milk for sustenance, and the endless, disorienting horizon where landmarks vanished. He was not a wealthy merchant or an official envoy, but a poor friar, and this very status forced him to rely on the often grudging hospitality of local chieftains, giving him a raw, ground-level view of steppe life few other Europeans ever witnessed. After months of hardship, he reached the court of the great Khan Mernk at Karakorum. His audience with the ruler of the world's largest land empire was a masterpiece of cultural collision. Rubruck, true to his mission, began to preach the gospel, explaining the concept of Christian divinity. Mernk Khan listened patiently, then called for representatives of the other faiths present at his cosmopolitan court, Buddhists, Muslims, and Nestorian Christians. He then declared in a statement that must have chilled the friar to his bone, that just as God gave different fingers to the hand, he gave different religions to different peoples. The Khan's duty was to honor them all. The hope for mass conversion was over before it began. Yet in the face of this profound spiritual failure, William of Rubruck achieved something far more lasting. Freed from the constraints of a successful diplomatic mission, he simply became the most observant man in the room. For months, he lived among the Mongols, attending their ceremonies, questioning their beliefs, and documenting everything with a scientist's precision. He described their mobile felt tents or yurts in exacting detail, from the felt coverings to the symbolic placement of the door facing south. He recorded their religious debates, their shamanistic rituals, and their astonishing tolerance for diverse faiths. He provided the first accurate European description of Buddhist meditation and prayer wheels. He even noted the presence of a Parisian silversmith and an Englishman at the Khan's court, revealing the surprising human networks that stretched across the globe. His report is often considered more reliable and objectively detailed than Marco Polo's for the region and period. Why then does Marco Polo live in legend while William of Rubruck remains in the footnotes? The answer lies in the nature of their stories. Polo's book was a tale of wonders and riches, a bestseller that fed the European imagination. Rubruck's report was a dense scholarly letter to his king, filled with theological debate and ethnographic detail, but lacking in gold and jewels. It was filed away, a secret intelligence report for a bygone era, but for historians it is a priceless window. Rubruck failed as a missionary, but he succeeded as one of history's greatest accidental anthropologists, capturing the daily rhythm, the spiritual complexity, and the formidable reality of the Mongol Empire at its zenith, not as a fable, but as a functioning, breathing world. The sheer scale of the Mongol Empire, witnessed firsthand by Rubruck, created a world of unprecedented connections, but it was from the ashes of that empire that a new maritime power would rise, one that would dominate the seas not with cavalry, but with the largest wooden ships ever built. In the early 15th century, the Yongle Emperor of China's Ming Dynasty launched a project of breathtaking ambition. He ordered the construction of a fleet unlike any the world had seen and placed it under the command of a remarkable man, the Grand Eunuch Admiral Zheng He. A Muslim by birth who rose to the highest echelons of the imperial court, Zheng He was a diplomat, a strategist, and a master of logistics. Between 1405 and 1433, he commanded 7 epic voyages that projected Ming power and prestige across the entire Indian Ocean. To understand his achievement, you must first picture his fleet. These were not just ships, they were floating cities. The legendary treasure ships, the flagships, were reported to be over 400 feet long. To put that in perspective, Christopher Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria, was about 85 feet long. Zheng He's vessels had 9 masts, carried hundreds of sailors and soldiers, and featured luxurious cabins and even deck gardens. They were accompanied by hundreds of support ships carrying horses, troops, fresh water, and trade goods. This armada was a technological marvel, a testament to Chinese shipbuilding that would not be rivaled in size for centuries. The voyages themselves were monumental exercises in statecraft. Zheng He's missions were not primarily for conquest or colonization, but for what the Chinese called showing the flag and collecting tribute. His fleet sailed to Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the east coast of Africa. They brought back envoys from dozens of kingdoms, exotic goods like giraffes and zebras for the imperial zoo, and vast amounts of knowledge. He established trade relations, mediated local disputes, and demonstrated the overwhelming might and sophistication of the Ming Dynasty. He erected stone steels in distant lands proclaiming the emperor's virtue, and his voyages effectively made the Indian Ocean a Chinese lake for a generation. And then suddenly it all stopped. After the 7th voyage, the entire enterprise was shut down. The great treasure ships were left to rot in their docks. The meticulous records of the voyages, the maps and logs, were deliberately burned by court officials. China, which had possessed the capability to circumnavigate the globe a century before the Europeans, deliberately turned its back on the sea and turned inward. This is one of history's most profound and puzzling reversals. Why would a nation abandon such clear dominance? Historians point to a perfect storm of factors. The voyages were phenomenally expensive, draining the imperial treasury for what some Confucian scholars saw as little more than vanity projects, bringing back strange animals and trinkets. A new emperor ascended the throne, more interested in fortifying the northern borders against Mongol resurgence than in funding oceanic adventures. The political faction that supported the eunuch admirals like Zheng He lost power to conservative bureaucrats who believed China possessed everything it needed within its own borders. They saw the voyages as wasteful and dangerous, exposing the empire to foreign ideas and potential threats. The burning of the records was the final symbolic act of this inward turn, an attempt to erase the very memory of this outward-looking chapter. The mystery of Zheng He's abandoned fleet forces us to ask a haunting counterfactual question. What if China had continued? What if its massive fleets had rounded the Cape of Good Hope and sailed into the Atlantic? The course of world history might have been utterly different. Instead, within a few decades, the shipyards decayed, the knowledge of building such leviathans faded, and the Indian Ocean was left open for the arrival of a new and very different kind of seafaring power from the distant shores of Europe. Zheng He's voyages were grounded in staggering reality. but the most influential medieval travel book of all was built from a tapestry of pure imagination. It was called The Travels of Sir John Manville, and for 2 centuries it was more widely read in Europe than Marco Polo's account. The book presented itself as the true memoir of an English knight from St. Albans who set out for the Holy Land in 1322 and spent the next 34 years traveling across the known world and far, far beyond. Readers were enthralled by his descriptions of the earthly paradise, of valleys filled with diamonds guarded by serpents, and of the fabled kingdom of Prester John, a Christian realm of immense wealth and virtue lost somewhere in the depths of Asia. He described races of people with a single giant foot used for shade and others with the heads of dogs who bark to communicate. The book was a phenomenal success, translated into every major European language and copied by hand in hundreds of manuscripts. And yet, from the very beginning, there was a profound mystery at its core. Who or what was Sir John Manville? The puzzle has consumed scholars for generations. There is no reliable historical record of any English knight by that name undertaking such a journey. The dates he provides are often contradictory, and the geography, while starting with accurate pilgrim routes to Jerusalem, quickly spirals into a world of pure fantasy. The prevailing theory today is that Sir John Manville never existed. He was a literary creation, a pseudonym used by a compiler, likely a French-speaking physician from Liege named Jean d'Outremeuse, who stitched together a dazzling collage from earlier sources. He borrowed heavily from the real accounts of travelers like Odoric of Pordenone and William of Boldensell, mixed in classical legends from Pliny the Elder, added a generous helping of popular fables and sermon exempla, and presented it all as a single, seamless first-person adventure. The genius of the book lies not in its originality, but in its compelling voice and its audacious scope. Manville presents himself as a trustworthy, pious, and curious guide. He often prefaces his most outlandish claims by saying, "I did not see this myself, but I was told by reliable people," lending a deceptive air of credibility. He describes the Sultan of Egypt criticizing the corruption of Christian Europe with shocking frankness, a passage that forced his readers to see themselves through the eyes of the other. This blend of the familiar and the fantastical made his world feel thrillingly vast and full of undiscovered wonders. Its greatest impact was on the European conception of the East. For centuries, the lands beyond the Mediterranean were a shadowy realm in the European mind, a place of both danger and desire. Mandeville's book filled that space with specific, if impossible, marvels. It codified the legend of Prester John, a powerful Christian monarch ruling a utopian kingdom beyond the lands of Islam, a figure who would haunt the dreams of explorers and popes for generations, prompting real missions to find him. His descriptions of spices, gold, and strange creatures fueled the commercial imagination, making the exotic seem tangible and worth seeking. Even as more accurate accounts from Marco Polo or Ibn Battuta circulated among the educated elite, Mandeville's stories held the popular imagination because they spoke to a deeper hunger, not just for trade routes, but for a world where magic was still real, where monsters walked, and where faith could triumph in the most distant corners of the earth. When Columbus sailed west, he carried ideas shaped as much by Mandeville's fantasies as by Polo's facts. So while the knight himself was a fiction, his travels were profoundly real in their consequences. He did not explore geography, he explored the human capacity for wonder, and in doing so, he charted the desires that would eventually send real ships over real horizons. Mandeville's fantastical tales captured the imagination, but the real world of Asia was being documented by a different kind of witness, one who walked the same roads as Marco Polo, but with a very different set of eyes. He was Friar Odoric of Pordenone, an Italian Franciscan missionary who set out from his monastery around the year 1318, driven not by commerce, but by a desire to preach and to see the far-flung Christian communities rumored to exist in the East. His journey would last over a decade, and the account he dictated upon his return, though often overshadowed, became a vital and puzzling piece of the medieval world puzzle. Odoric's route was extraordinary. He traveled through the Middle East, then sailed down the Persian Gulf and across the Indian Ocean. He visited India, Sumatra, Java, and Borneo, and most historians believe he finally reached the great port of Zaytun in China, modern-day Quanzhou. From there, he journeyed inland, possibly all the way to the Mongol capital of Khanbalik, where he reported finding a thriving Nestorian Christian community. His descriptions provide a fascinating counterpoint to other travelers, where Marco Polo noted administrative details and commercial wonders. Odoric, the pious friar, focused on the spiritual and the strange. He gives one of the first detailed European descriptions of the Chinese practice of foot binding, which he observed with a mixture of horror and fascination, noting how wealthy women had their feet tightly bound from childhood to keep them small. He also described the Grand Canal, that immense artificial waterway, with awe, recognizing it as a feat of human engineering that surpassed anything in Europe. His account is filled with these moments of genuine observation, which lend it credibility, yet woven seamlessly into this plausible travelogue are episodes of pure wonder that echo Manville. He describes a magical pearl that bestowed invincibility in battle, and he claims to have visited the land of the Pygmies, where the people were no taller than a 3-year-old child. He tells of a valley where the souls of the dead could be seen as swirling sparks of light. For modern readers, these passages create a jarring contrast. How could the same man who accurately described the Grand Canal also believe in tiny people and ghostly valleys? The answer lies in the medieval mind itself. For Odoric, the world was inherently miraculous. The boundary between the natural and the supernatural was porous. A strange custom in a distant land was no less believable than a canal 1,000 miles long. Both were marvels that testified to the boundless diversity of God's creation. His reports were not intended as a geographical survey, but as an edifying text, a record of divine wonders meant to inspire faith. This pious perspective is what makes his work so distinct from merchant accounts. He evaluated cultures not by their wealth, but by their proximity to Christian virtue or their shocking divergence from it. His narrative, with its blend of fact and pious legend, was immensely popular in its day. It was copied and circulated widely, feeding directly into the compilation that would become the Travels of Sir John Manville. In this way, Odoric served as a crucial bridge. He provided real, verifiable details that enriched Europe's knowledge of Asian geography and customs, while simultaneously reinforcing the idea that the East was a realm where the normal rules of reality might not apply. His journey reminds us that for the medieval explorer, discovery was never just about mapping land, it was about mapping the very limits of belief. The fantastical tales of Odoric and Manville spread like wildfire, but the most consequential journey of the era began with a far more practical goal: profit. Two Venetian brothers, Niccolo and Maffei Polo, were successful jewel merchants operating out of Constantinople. In the year 1260, seeking new markets, they made a bold decision. They would not wait for goods to come to them on the Silk Road. They would travel its entire length to the source. With a stock of precious gems, easy to transport and immensely valuable, they set out for the court of Berk Khan, ruler of the Golden Horde in Sarai on the Volga River. Their commercial venture was successful, but fate intervened. A war erupted between Berk Khan and his cousin Hulagu, blocking their safe return route west. Rather than turn back into conflict, the Polo brothers did something extraordinary. They decided to go further east, deeper into the unknown. This detour would change history. For an entire year, they traveled across the vast Central Asian steppes, finally arriving in the splendid city of Bukhara. There they lingered for 3 years, likely continuing their trade. It was in Bukhara that they encountered an envoy of the supreme Mongol ruler, a man whose name would define their legacy, Kublai Khan. The envoy, impressed by the cultured Italian merchants, invited them to accompany him to the great Khan's court. They agreed, embarking on a year-long journey that brought them, in 1265 or 66, to the summer capital of Shangdu, the fabled Xanadu. Their reception was momentous. Kublai Khan, a ruler deeply curious about the world beyond his borders, was fascinated by these Latins from the distant West. He questioned them extensively about European politics, religion, and customs. The brothers, savvy and articulate, made an excellent impression. When they prepared to depart after a year at court, Kublai Khan entrusted them with a mission that was both diplomatic and deeply personal. He gave them a golden tablet of safe conduct, a pesa, granting them protection and provisions across his empire. More importantly, he gave them a letter for the Pope. In it, he requested 100 learned men, well-versed in Christianity and the 7 arts, to come and debate with the scholars of his court. He also asked for a small amount of oil from the lamp burning at the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, a sacred relic. The Khan's requests reveal a mind open to intellectual and spiritual exchange, viewing Christianity not as a threat, but as another system of knowledge worthy of examination. The Polo brothers' return to Venice in 1269 was a saga in itself, taking nearly 3 years. They arrived to find that the Pope Clement IV had died, and a long interregnum had left no one to answer Kublay's letter. They waited for 2 years for a new pontiff to be elected. Finally, with the papal seat still vacant and fearing the Khan's patience would wear thin, they decided to return to the east. This time they took with them Niccolo's 17-year-old son, a young man named Marco. Their story is the essential prologue. Without the initial courage, commercial acumen, and diplomatic skill of Niccolo and Maffei, the famous journey of Marco Polo might never have happened. They were the pioneers who forged the first direct, high-level link between Europe and the Yuan dynasty, proving that such a journey was not only possible, but potentially lucrative and politically significant. They were not myth-makers or missionaries, but merchants whose pursuit of trade inadvertently opened a corridor for an unprecedented exchange of knowledge, setting the stage for the most famous travel account in history. While the Polos sought trade and Rubruk sought conversion, the next wave of European travelers had a far more urgent and grim purpose: survival. The Mongol invasions of Eastern Europe in the 1240s were not just a military defeat, they were a profound psychological trauma. Entire kingdoms like Poland and Hungary were shattered, their armies annihilated. The terrifying rumors spoke of an invincible, inhuman horde from the ends of the earth. In this atmosphere of panic, the newly elected Pope Innocent IV made a desperate and unprecedented decision. If he could not stop the Mongols with armies, he would try to reach them with words. He dispatched not one but 2 separate missions of Franciscan friars directly into the heart of the enemy's territory. Their orders were not to preach or trade, but to gather intelligence and deliver papal letters demanding the Mongols cease their attacks and convert to Christianity. The men chosen for this perilous task were Giovanni da Pian del Carpine and Asselin of Lombardy. Giovanni, a senior Franciscan in his 60s, was sent on the longer, northern route to the court of the great Khan himself. His journey, beginning in 1245, was a brutal test of endurance. He and his companion traveled on horseback through winter snows, often with minimal food, across the war-ravaged landscapes of Eastern Europe, and then onto the endless freezing steppe. After a grueling year of travel, they reached the Mongol capital at Karakorum, just in time for the election of Guyuk Khan as the new supreme ruler. Giovanni was present for the lavish coronation ceremonies, an event he described with a mixture of awe and deep suspicion. He delivered the Pope's letters, which sternly questioned the Mongols' right to invade Christian lands and urged them to accept baptism. The Khan's response, which Giovanni carried back, was a masterpiece of imperial arrogance. Guyuk Khan dismissed the Pope's authority, declared that the Mongols ruled by the eternal power of heaven, and commanded the Pope and all European kings to come in person to Karakorum to offer their submission. Diplomatically, the mission was a complete failure, but as an intelligence-gathering operation, it was a landmark success. Giovanni's detailed report, The History of the Mongols, was the first comprehensive European study of their enemy. He meticulously documented their military tactics, their social structure, their harsh laws, and their incredible mobility. He explained how their armies were organized into decimal units, how they used terror as a weapon, and why they seemed unstoppable. His work was not a book of marvels, but a sober field manual for survival, written to help Christendom understand the nature of the existential threat it faced. The second mission, led by Friar Asselin, had a similar goal but a very different outcome. Sent to the Mongol commander Beiju in Persia, Asselin's approach was defiant from the start. He refused to perform the obligatory acts of submission, such as prostrating himself before the Mongol general. His demeanor was not that of a diplomat, but of a papal envoy expecting deference. The result was a diplomatic disaster. Beiju, insulted by this lack of respect, imprisoned the friars and condemned them to death. For weeks they awaited execution, saved only by the intervention of Beiju's Christian wife and the pragmatic counsel of his advisors, who argued that killing envoys was bad policy. Asselin was finally released, but only after being forced to witness the execution of his own interpreter. He returned with nothing but a reinforced sense of Mongol brutality, and a letter even more contemptuous than the one Giovanni carried. Where Giovanni's journey yielded vital knowledge, Assellin's nearly ended in martyrdom and yielded only confirmation of European fears. Together, these two friars represent the first clumsy steps of European diplomacy into a world it did not understand and deeply feared. They were not explorers in the romantic sense, they were scouts sent behind enemy lines. Their grim, practical reports stripped away the mythical monsters that populated European maps and replaced them with a far more frightening reality, a highly disciplined, expansionist empire that viewed the Pope as just another petty ruler to be summoned and subdued. They brought back no spices or silks, only a chilling ultimatum and a blueprint of a formidable enemy. In doing so, they performed a crucial, if terrifying, service. They transformed the Mongol threat from a supernatural plague into a political and military problem that could, however difficultly, be analyzed, prepared for, and perhaps one day, engaged with on terms beyond sheer terror. While the friars were navigating the steppe with fear and scripture, mastery of the open ocean was being perfected far to the south by a different kind of scholar. In the bustling ports of the Arabian Peninsula and the western Indian Ocean, the most respected voice on the water belonged to a man named Ahmad ibn Majid. Born around 1421 into a family of navigators in Oman, Ibn Majid was not an explorer seeking new lands, but a master of the sea as it was already known. His expertise was so profound that he earned the title Lion of the Sea, and his true legacy lies in the pages of nearly 40 works on navigation, transforming a lifetime of practical experience into a formal science. His world was the Indian Ocean, a maritime highway connecting East Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. For centuries, Arab and Swahili traders had sailed these routes with an intimate knowledge passed down orally from father to son. Ibn Majid did something revolutionary. He wrote it all down. He composed detailed sailing manuals called ramangs and poetic verses filled with navigational instructions. These works cataloged everything a pilot needed to know: the precise locations of ports and hidden reefs, the depths of coastal waters, the behavior of currents, and most critically, the complex cycle of the monsoon winds. He understood that the monsoon was not a hazard but an engine. Sailors would ride the southwest monsoon to India in the summer, wait for the winds to reverse, and then catch the northeast monsoon back to Arabia and Africa in the winter. This predictable rhythm made the Indian Ocean a truly connected world long before European caravels arrived. His technical skill was exemplified by his use of the camel, a deceptively simple navigational tool. It was a small rectangular plate of wood connected to a knotted string. A sailor would hold the camel at arm's length, aligning the bottom with the horizon and the top with the North Star. By using different knots on the string, which corresponded to different latitudes, he could determine his ship's position north or south with remarkable accuracy. This tool, along with the astrolabe and a deep understanding of stellar constellations, allowed Ibn Majid and his peers to sail across open water with confidence, not just creep along the coast. But Ibn Majid's story takes a dramatic and controversial turn at the very end of the 15th century, a turn that places him at a pivotal crossroads of world history. In the year 1498, the Portuguese captain Vasco da Gama, after a brutal voyage around the Cape of Good Hope, struggled up the East African coast. He was in unknown waters, his crew was sick with scurvy, and he desperately needed a pilot who knew the route across the Arabian Sea to the rich markets of India. According to some Portuguese accounts in a later Arabic history, da Gama found such a pilot in the port of Malindi in modern-day Kenya. That pilot, the sources suggest, was none other than the aging master navigator, Ahmad ibn Majid. The implications of this claim are staggering. It would mean that the man who literally wrote the book on Indian Ocean navigation personally ushered in the very force that would destroy the world he knew. He would have guided the first European fleet directly into the heart of the Indian Ocean trading network, unlocking its secrets for a powerful and aggressive new competitor. The controversy among historians is intense. Many Arab scholars vehemently reject the idea, considering it a colonial myth designed to diminish Arab achievement by suggesting they needed European guidance to reach their own destinations. The evidence is circumstantial, based on a single, possibly misinterpreted, reference in a later text. Whether true or not, the legend persists because it embodies a profound historical irony. The open, interconnected system of trade that Ibn Majid spent his life documenting was about to be overtaken by a new model, one defined by armed caravels, fortified ports, and monopolies enforced by cannon fire. So was Ahmed Ibn Majid, the pilot who guided Vasco da Gama. We may never know for certain, but his true, undeniable monument is not in that single disputed voyage. It is in the vast written knowledge he preserved, a complete operating manual for a maritime world at its peak, a world that was already ancient and sophisticated long before the age of discovery ever dawned in the West. The sophisticated maritime world of Ibn Majid was a realm of trade winds and celestial navigation, but 5 centuries earlier, a very different kind of sailor had navigated by instinct and courage across a far colder sea. His name was Leif Erikson, and his story is written not in official logs, but in the epic Icelandic sagas passed down by word of mouth for generations before being written on parchment. According to these tales, around the year 1000, this son of the infamous Eric the Red heard a story from a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had been blown off course and sighted a mysterious forested coastline far to the west of Greenland. Intrigued, Leif bought Bjarni's ship, gathered a crew of 35 men, and set out to find this land. His voyage was a deliberate exploration into the unknown North Atlantic, a leap beyond the Norse settlements of Iceland and Greenland. The sagas describe a sequence of discoveries, first a barren, flat land of stone slabs he called Helluland, likely Baffin Island, then a wooded coast with white sand beaches he named Markland, thought to be Labrador. Finally, pushing further south, he reached a place so temperate and rich that he decided to winter there. He called it Vinland, saying they found wild grapes and self-sown wheat, and the climate was so mild that dew on the grass tasted sweet. For centuries, the story of Vinland was considered just that, a compelling legend from the sagas. Then in the 1960s, a Norwegian explorer and archaeologist named Helge Ingstad and his wife Anne Stein made a discovery that rewrote history. On the northern tip of Newfoundland, at a place called Elandsaux Meadows, they uncovered the unmistakable remains of a Norse settlement. They found the foundations of 8 turf-walled buildings, identical in construction to those in Iceland and Greenland, including a forge for working iron and a carpentry workshop. They found a bronze cloak pin, a stone oil lamp, and iron nails, all of Norse origin, dated to around the year 1000. This was not a temporary camp, but a substantial base, a gateway for further exploration. Elandsaux Meadows is the definitive proof that Norse explorers reached North America 500 years before Columbus. It confirms the sagas as containing a core of historical truth. But the site also deepens the mystery because it was not Vinland itself. The sagas describe Vinland as a place ideal for permanent settlement, with ample grazing land and those precious grapes. Elandsaux Meadows, with its colder climate and lack of wild grapes, was more likely a strategic repair station and winter camp, a launching point for expeditions further south. This raises tantalizing questions. How far south did the Vikings actually sail? Did they explore the Gulf of St. Lawrence or even reach the coast of present-day New England? A few intriguing, though hotly debated, clues suggest they might have. The so-called Kensington runestone found in Minnesota is almost certainly a modern hoax, but other less sensational finds, like a possible Norse coin from the Maine coast and vague references in Native American oral histories, keep the possibility alive. Yet the greatest enigma is not how far they went, but why they left. The Norse settlements in North America were not overrun or destroyed. They were simply abandoned after perhaps a decade or two of sporadic use. The sagas speak of escalating conflict with the indigenous people they called Skraelings, likely the Beothuk or Dorset peoples, describing battles that frightened the outnumbered Norse. Beyond conflict, the settlements were simply too distant and too difficult to sustain. Maintaining a regular supply line from Greenland, itself a fragile colony, across hundreds of miles of treacherous ocean proved impossible. The economic incentive was not strong enough. Timber and furs could be found closer to home in Markland, so the door to the New World, opened so bravely by Leif Erikson, slowly swung shut. The knowledge of Vinland faded into legend, preserved only in stories told around Icelandic hearths. It was a path not taken, a fleeting contact that left no permanent mark, waiting to be rediscovered half a millennium later by a different world with different ambitions. The enduring power of Leif's story lies in that fleeting moment of contact, a testament to human reach exceeding its grasp, a preview of a continent that would remain, for the Norse, a promise unfulfilled. Leif Erikson's voyage to Vinland was not an isolated gamble, but the climax of a family saga of exile and survival that began with his father. Erik Thorvaldsson, better known to history as Erik the Red, earned his fiery nickname not for his hair, but for his temper. After being exiled from Norway for manslaughter, he settled in Iceland, only to find himself embroiled in another violent feud. The result was the same, a sentence of outlawry, banishing him from Icelandic shores for 3 years. With nowhere to go but the open ocean, Erik turned his exile into an expedition. He sailed west, aiming for a shadowy land glimpsed by earlier sailors, a place they had grimly named Greenland. When he finally made landfall after a brutal journey, he was confronted by a world of staggering contradiction. The place was in large part a frozen wilderness of glaciers and rocky fjords. But along the southern fjords, he found sheltered valleys with grassland suitable for grazing, a sliver of hope in an unforgiving landscape. With his exile ending, he returned to Iceland with a masterstroke of propaganda. He called the place Greenland, knowing full well that an appealing name would attract settlers more readily than an honest one. His scheme worked. Around 985, he led a fleet of 25 ships carrying hundreds of colonists to establish the first permanent European settlements in the Americas, centuries before Columbus. They founded the eastern settlement near modern-day Qaqortoq, and later the smaller western settlement farther up the coast. Life in Norse Greenland was a constant negotiation with extremity. The settlers built stone and turf farmsteads modeled on their Icelandic homes, raised sheep and cattle, and hunted walrus and seal. They were Christians, building a cathedral and even exporting walrus ivory and narwhal tusks to Europe as tithes to the church. For nearly 500 years, these communities clung to the edge of the world, maintaining a distinctly European lifestyle in an environment that was increasingly hostile to it. And then they vanished. The last written record of the Norse Greenlanders is a wedding recorded in the Eastern Settlement Church in the early 1400s. After that silence, when a ship finally arrived from Iceland in the 1500s, the crew found only abandoned farms, empty churches, and the bones of livestock. What happened to them? The disappearance of the Greenland Norse is one of medieval history's most haunting cold cases. The evidence points not to a single catastrophe, but to a slow, grinding collapse from multiple pressures. The primary suspect is climate change. Just as the Norse arrived during a relatively warm period, the onset of the Little Ice Age from the 1300s onward brought longer winters, shorter growing seasons, and expanded sea ice that blocked crucial trade routes to Iceland and Europe. This isolation was economic poison. They could no longer export their valuable ivory or import essential goods like iron, timber, and grain. At the same time, they faced competition for resources from the Thule culture ancestors of the modern Inuit, who migrated into the region. The Inuit, with their superior technology for Arctic survival like kayaks, toggle harpoons, and skin clothing, thrived in the changing climate where the Norse struggled. Crucially, the Norse seem to have stubbornly maintained their European identity. Archaeological evidence shows they continued to wear woolen clothing unsuitable for the wet cold, and their diet remained heavily dependent on their livestock, even as seal and marine resources became more critical. They did not adopt Inuit hunting techniques or build the kinds of relationships that might have provided a lifeline. Theories abound. Did they starve? Were they wiped out by conflict? Did they finally abandon their homes and sail away, perhaps to merge with other populations? The most likely answer is a tragic combination, a society that became trapped by its own traditions, slowly strangled by a changing climate, economic irrelevance, and an inability to adapt to the new reality of the world they had chosen. Erik the Red's bold colony, founded on a clever lie and immense courage, ultimately became a monument to human fragility, a community that flourished for centuries on a razor's edge, only to quietly vanish into the very ice that defined it. The story of Leif the Lucky was built on a foundation of someone else's mistake. A merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson was sailing from Iceland to Greenland around the year 986, aiming to visit his father who had settled with Erik the Red. The voyage should have been straightforward, but the North Atlantic had other plans. A fierce storm blew up, shrouding the sea in fog for days and driving his ship far off course. When the weather finally cleared, Bjarni and his crew found themselves staring at an unknown coastline. It was not the icy mountains of Greenland. This land was low, forested, and utterly unfamiliar. Bjarni was a practical man, a trader, not an explorer. His cargo was his livelihood, and his goal was to reach his father. He knew this was not his destination. So despite his crew's urging to go ashore and investigate this strange new world, Bjarni refused. He ordered the ship to turn back out to sea, and after sailing north for several days, he eventually corrected his course and found Greenland. In doing so, Bjarni Herjolfsson became the first European we know of to lay eyes on the continent of North America, and he deliberately turned away from it. His was a discovery of pure accident, immediately rejected, yet his story, told later in Iceland, became the vital spark. It was his description of that wooded coast that would ignite the ambition in Leif Erikson to go and see it for himself. Bjarni represents the road not taken, a man who held history in his hands for a moment and then let it slip away, concerned only with the practicalities of his original voyage. That spark, however, was more than enough for another man. Thorfinn Karlsefni was a wealthy Icelandic merchant of great stature and ambition. Hearing the tales of Leif's Vinland, he saw not just a place for exploration, but an opportunity for a permanent colony. Around the year 1010, he organized the most serious and well-equipped attempt the Norse ever made to plant roots in the New World. His expedition was a small fleet carrying over 160 men and women, along with livestock and all the supplies needed to start a new life. They sailed to Leif's old camp at Leifsbudir, likely the site we know as Elandsok's Meadows, and used it as their base. For the first year or two, the sagas say they prospered. They explored the region, noting the abundant salmon, the tall grass, and the wild grapes. They traded with the indigenous people, whom they called Skrælings, a vague term that likely referred to the Beothuk or Dorset peoples. The initial encounters were peaceful, even curious. The Norse would trade milk and red cloth for furs, but this fragile peace was built on a foundation of profound mutual misunderstanding, and it quickly shattered. The turning point, as the sagas tell it, was an act of sheer terror. A bull belonging to the Norse herd broke loose and charged, bellowing toward the group of Skrælings. To the Norse, this was a familiar farm animal. To the indigenous people, who had never seen a creature of that size or sound, it was a monstrous beast. They fled in panic back to their boats. When they returned, it was not for trade but for war. A battle ensued. The Norse, with their iron weapons and armor, held a technological advantage, but they were vastly outnumbered and fighting on unfamiliar ground. Thorfinn Karlsefni, a shrewd leader, realized the fundamental truth of their situation during the fighting. He saw that despite their weapons, the Skrælings could replace any lost warrior almost instantly from their vast population, while every Norse casualty was irreplaceable. They were an isolated outpost on a continent teeming with people who saw them as intruders. The dream of a peaceful, thriving Vinland colony evaporated in that moment of violent clarity. After another season, facing the constant threat of attack and recognizing the impossibility of their long-term survival, Thorfinn made the difficult decision. He ordered the expedition to pack up, to gather what they could, and to sail back to Greenland. The great colonization attempt was over. The fleeting Norse footprint in North America, from Bjarni's accidental sighting to Thorfinn's abandoned settlement, presents us with a powerful historical what if. They had the ships, the skill, and the courage to cross the Atlantic. What they lacked was the numbers, the adaptability, and perhaps most crucially, the overwhelming motive to push through the immense hardship and conflict. For them, Vinland remained a distant outpost, a risky venture that ultimately cost more than it promised to return. They left behind only some sod walls, a handful of artifacts, and a saga that would be remembered as legend for 1,000 years. Their failure, however, opens a window onto a different kind of exploration, one driven not by trade or conquest, but by a search so profound it would send men walking across continents. The Norse failure in Vinland stemmed from a lack of overwhelming purpose, but the most powerful engine for exploration is often not gold or land, but a story that refuses to be disbelieved. For centuries, the rulers and map makers of Europe were captivated by a single shimmering legend, the kingdom of Prester John. He was said to be a Christian monarch of immense piety and even greater power, a direct descendant of the three Magi, ruling a paradise on earth somewhere in the distant east, beyond the reach of Muslim empires. His realm was described in a letter that began circulating in the 1260s, addressed to the Byzantine Emperor and the Holy Roman Emperor. This document was a masterpiece of medieval fantasy, detailing a land where pepper grew like forests, where a fountain of youth granted eternal life, and where giants and men with eyes in their chests served in his army. Most importantly, Prester John promised to march westward with his vast forces to aid his fellow Christians against their enemies. For a Europe battered by crusader losses and fearful of Mongol invasions, this letter was not mere entertainment. It was a divine promise, a potential ally of unimaginable strength waiting in the wings of history. The letter itself was almost certainly a forgery, likely crafted within European monastic circles, but its impact was utterly real. It gave concrete shape to a deep, persistent hope that Christendom was not alone, that a powerful Christian empire flourished in isolation, preserving ancient faith and purity. This belief fundamentally altered how Europeans saw the world. Cartographers began drawing the kingdom of Prester John onto their maps, a massive territory blocking the expansion of Islam from the rear. Its location, however, was frustratingly vague, and it began to drift. Initially placed in Central Asia, perhaps in the lands of the Mongols, the legend shifted as real travelers like Marco Polo returned with detailed accounts of Asia, but no sign of the legendary king. Polo did his best to accommodate the myth, reporting that he had heard of a Christian ruler named Prester John who had been defeated by Genghis Khan, essentially writing the legend into the past. But the story was too potent to die. If Prester John was not in Asia, then he must be somewhere else. The focus of the search pivoted dramatically to Africa. Rumors of ancient Christian kingdoms like Ethiopia, isolated in the highlands and known to Europeans only through fragmented reports, provided the perfect new vessel for the myth. By the 1400s, Portuguese explorers sailing down the African coast were driven by a dual mission: to find a sea route to the spice markets of India and to make contact with the legendary kingdom of Prester John, whom they now firmly believed ruled in Ethiopia. This was no longer just a fairy tale, it was a geopolitical objective. In 1490, the Portuguese explorer Pero da Cavalha, after a staggering journey through the Indian Ocean, was dispatched overland specifically to reach the court of Prester John. He actually succeeded in reaching Ethiopia, a real and ancient Christian kingdom, and he spent the rest of his life there, an honored but permanent guest of the Ethiopian emperor. His reports back to Lisbon confirmed the existence of a powerful Christian monarch in East Africa, which seemed to validate the centuries-old legend. The final poignant chapter came in the 1520s when a Portuguese embassy led by Dom Rodrigo de Lima finally reached the Ethiopian court. They found a magnificent and devout Christian civilization, but it was not the mythical paradise of the letter. There was no fountain of youth, no armies of giants. The Ethiopian emperors, while pleased to establish contact with a fellow Christian power, were baffled by the Europeans' insistence on calling them Prester John, a title they never used. The legend, born from hope and forged in a letter, had finally collided with reality. The collision did not create an alliance of equals, but it did forge a real connection that lasted for generations. The enduring mystery of Prester John is not about a lost kingdom, but about the power of narrative to shape history. A fictional letter, a hopeful forgery, literally redirected the course of exploration for hundreds of years, sending ships and envoys across deserts and oceans in pursuit of a phantom. It proves that the most compelling terra incognita on any medieval map was not a physical place, but the landscape of human longing itself. The legend of Prester John was a map drawn by desire, but the most accurate picture of the medieval world was being pieced together from hard-won reports in a quiet workshop on the island of Majorca. There, a Jewish cartographer named Abraham Kresk, alongside his son Jehuda, performed a different kind of exploration. They never sailed a ship or crossed a desert, but they explored the very limits of human knowledge, synthesizing it into a single, breathtaking artifact. In 1375, they presented their masterpiece to the Crown Prince of Aragon, a work now known as the Catalan Atlas. It was not just a map, it was a visual encyclopedia of the entire known world, from the Atlantic to China, and it represented the absolute pinnacle of medieval geographical science. Crafted on 6 large panels of varnished wood, the Atlas is a stunning fusion of sources. Kresk and his son were masters of the Portoland chart, those incredibly accurate navigational maps used by Mediterranean sailors, filled with detailed coastlines and compass roses. But they layered onto this maritime foundation the overland travel accounts of men like Marco Polo, and the sophisticated geographical theories inherited from Arab scholars. The result is a hybrid creature, part practical sailing guide, part illustrated storybook of the world. One of its most famous panels shows the Sahara Desert, and riding across it on a camel is a magnificent golden figure holding a scepter and a huge nugget of gold. This is Mansa Musa, the legendary emperor of Mali, whose pilgrimage to Mecca decades earlier had flooded the Mediterranean with so much gold it crashed local economies. His inclusion here is not just decoration, it is a data point acknowledging the immense wealth and power of a West African empire that most European maps simply ignored. The atlas stretches east along the Silk Road, depicting the cities of Cathay that Polo described, and south into the Indian Ocean, charting the monsoon routes that Arab and Swahili sailors had mastered. It shows the trade winds, the spice islands, and the distant lands where pepper and cloves originated. In many ways, the Catalan Atlas is a snapshot of a truly globalized medieval economy, seen through the eyes of its most informed mapmakers. But this breathtaking accuracy is the source of its greatest mystery. Where did Abraham Cresques get his information? The details are too precise, the scope too vast to have come from the handful of travel accounts that have survived to our time. He clearly had access to a library of sources, both written and oral, that are now lost to history. Perhaps he consulted with Jewish merchants who were part of far-flung trading networks stretching from Morocco to India. Maybe he studied Arabic portolans and geographical texts that have since disappeared. The atlas itself is a testament to a vibrant, multicultural exchange of knowledge in the medieval Mediterranean, a collaboration between Christian patrons, Jewish scholars, and Muslim science that later centuries would forget. The silent tragedy of the Catalan Atlas lies in its timing and its fate. Created in 1375, it captured the world at a moment of maximum connection, just before the upheavals of the Black Death and the rise of aggressively exclusive empires began to sever some of those threads. Furthermore, Abraham Cresques and his son Jehuda were Jewish in a time of rising intolerance. Within a few decades, violent pogroms swept across the Iberian Peninsula, and Jehuda was forced to convert to Christianity to save his life, taking the name Jom Ribes. The workshop that produced such a luminous synthesis of world knowledge was extinguished by prejudice. The atlas itself, however, endured as a lonely beacon. It showed what was possible when curiosity triumphed over dogma, and it presented a world that was round, interconnected, and wondrously detailed, waiting just beyond the horizon. It was a map that did not just show places, but possibilities, and it would quietly guide the ambitions of the next generation of explorers, who would soon set sail with a very different kind of mission. The detailed terror captured by Friar Giovanni was not a story of monsters, but a manual for survival. His report, the Historia Mongolorum, reads with the cold clarity of a military intelligence briefing, a document born from the urgent need to understand an enemy that had nearly destroyed Eastern Europe. Sent by Pope Innocent IV in his mid-60s, Giovanni da Pine del Carpine did not travel as a merchant seeking profit or a pilgrim seeking grace. He traveled as a scout, moving directly into the heart of the greatest existential threat Christendom had ever faced. His journey itself was a brutal feat of endurance, a year-long trek across the frozen steppe on horseback, often with minimal food, through land still scarred by recent Mongol conquests. That a man of his age survived this ordeal is a testament to a willpower fueled by sheer necessity. When he finally reached the Mongol capital at Karakorum, he arrived at a pivotal moment, the election of the new great Khan, Guyuk. This timing was both a curse and a blessing. It meant he was subject to the delays and rituals of a vast political ceremony, but it also gave him a front-row seat to the inner workings of the empire at its most potent and ceremonial. His account of the coronation is meticulously observed, noting the thousands of envoys bearing tribute, the lavish feasts, and the precise order of submission required from all present. He was not there to marvel, he was there to analyze, and analyze he did. Giovanni's report systematically dismantles the European image of the Mongols as a mindless horde, replacing it with a chilling portrait of a highly disciplined, efficiently organized military machine. He details their universal conscription, how every man was a soldier from adolescence to old age. He explains their decimal command structure, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, which created a clear chain of command and made armies highly maneuverable. He describes their tactics of feigned retreat, their use of terror by slaughtering entire populations to demoralize future enemies, and their incredible logistical planning, where scouts would plot routes years in advance to ensure pasture for their vast herds of horses. He even notes their psychological warfare, like tying branches to their horses' tails to kick up enormous clouds of dust, making their forces appear far larger than they were. Beyond the battlefield, he documented their social customs and laws with an anthropologist's eye. He explained the importance of the Pesa, the tablet of authority that granted safe passage. He described their diet of fermented mare's milk and meat, their tolerance for extreme cold, and their surprising legal code, which prescribed death for crimes as seemingly minor as drawing a knife in anger or stepping on the threshold of a commander's tent. This was not a collection of exotic curiosities, it was a vulnerability assessment. Giovanni was answering the most pressing questions of European rulers: how do they fight, how do they govern, and what are their weaknesses? His report's greatest value, however, lay in its sober realism. He dispelled the comforting myth that the Mongols were the lost tribes of Israel or the armies of Gog and Magog, supernatural foes against whom ordinary strategy was useless. By presenting them as formidable but comprehensible humans operating within a logical, if harsh, system, he transformed the threat from a divine punishment into a geopolitical problem. The Historia Mongolorum became the foundational text for all subsequent European engagement with the East. It provided a template for later missionary diplomats like William of Rubruck, who studied it before his own journey. It gave kings and popes a factual basis for planning defense or diplomacy, showing that negotiation, however difficult, might be possible. For historians, it is an irreplaceable primary source, a snapshot of the Mongol Empire's administration and military doctrine at the very moment of its greatest territorial extent, filtered through the desperate, perceptive eyes of an elderly friar who understood that the first step to confronting a shadow is to hold a lantern up to it, no matter how terrifying the details it reveals. While cartographers like Cresques charted the world from a distance, other men measured it with their own weary feet, driven by a faith that demanded physical witness. In the early spring of 1102, an English pilgrim named Ceolwulf boarded a ship in southern Italy, bound for the Holy Land. He was not a knight, a merchant, or a diplomat, but a devout and ordinary man undertaking the most dangerous journey of his life. He set sail just 3 years after the armies of the First Crusade had violently captured Jerusalem, and his pilgrimage would provide one of the most raw and immediate accounts of the world those wars had created. The voyage itself was a gauntlet of terror. The Mediterranean of Ceolwulf's time was not a unified sea, but a fractured, lawless space. His ship was constantly hunted. Greek pirates based in Byzantine waters preyed on the growing traffic of Latin pilgrims, seeing them as lucrative targets. Arab fleets from North Africa still controlled key passages, and the shifting political sands meant that a safe port one season could be a hostile trap the next. Ceolwulf's account is filled with near misses, of ships fleeing into storms to escape pursuers, and of the ever-present fear of being captured, enslaved, or thrown overboard. This was not the orderly movement of Crusader armies, but the chaotic, perilous aftermath, where the routes they had opened were now stalked by new dangers. When he finally landed at the port of Jaffa, he entered a landscape utterly transformed. This was the new Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, a fragile European outpost grafted onto the ancient soil of the Levant. Ceolwulf's observations are those of a pious traveler, not a soldier. He visited the holy sites with a reverent eye, describing the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, still bearing the scars of recent conflict and undergoing repairs. He noted the bustling, polyglot nature of Jerusalem, now filled with Frankish lords, Italian merchants, and the local Eastern Christian, Muslim, and Jewish populations who now lived under foreign rule. His narrative captures the strange dissonance of the place, where the ecstasy of spiritual fulfillment for pilgrims coexisted with the tense military reality of a kingdom surrounded by enemies. But his journey did not end in Jerusalem. Driven by faith, he ventured further, traveling to the river Jordan and to the monasteries of the Judean desert. Here the dangers shifted from the sea to the land. The roads were plagued by bandits, and the countryside was still unstable. His writings give us a street-level view of the logistical nightmare of maintaining these new crusader states. Supply lines were tenuous, communication was slow, and the authority of the new king barely extended beyond the major cities and castles. For Ceolwulf, every mile was an act of devotion and a gamble with death. His pilgrimage, one of the first recorded after the Crusader conquest, reframes our understanding of the Crusades themselves. Beyond the grand narratives of clashing armies and religious zeal, his story reveals them as a catalyst for a vast, unplanned migration. Thousands of ordinary people like him, armed with faith rather than swords, now stream toward Jerusalem, creating a new social and economic reality. They needed guides, ships, lodging, and protection, spawning entire industries along the route. Ceolwulf's gritty, personal ordeal shows us that the Crusades were not just a military campaign, but a powerful force of human movement, connecting the villages of England to the shrines of Palestine through a fragile, treacherous thread of hope and desperation. His footsteps trace the human cost of a holy war, not on the battlefield, but on the long, lonely road home. Ceolwulf's perilous pilgrimage was a journey to a holy land already claimed, but other men of faith ventured into territories where the cross had never been planted. Decades after the last papal envoy had left the Mongol court, a lone Franciscan friar named John of Montecorvino arrived in the great city of Khanbalik, modern-day Beijing, with a quiet, monumental ambition. He did not come with a fleet, an army, or even a proper companion for most of the journey. He came alone around the year 1294, carrying only his vestments, a Bible, and an unwavering conviction. His mission, self-assigned and staggering in its scope, was to establish a permanent Catholic church in the capital of the Mongol Yuan dynasty. Against all odds, he would not only succeed, but he would become the first Archbishop of Beijing, a story of solitary perseverance that stands as one of the medieval church's most overlooked triumphs. John's journey itself was an act of sheer endurance. He traveled the overland Silk Road, a route still perilous decades after the Polos had used it. His letters back to Europe, our primary source for his life, speak of hardships and isolation, but they are devoid of self-pity. He was a man focused entirely on the task ahead. When he finally reached Khanbalik, he faced a landscape of spiritual competition. The court of the Great Khan was a kaleidoscope of faiths, with Nestorian Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, and Taoists all vying for influence and favor. John was not the first Christian there, but he was the first Latin Catholic missionary to attempt a lasting foundation. He began, characteristically, with work. He purchased 40 young boys from pagan families, likely victims of war or poverty, with funds sent from the West. He baptized them and began to teach them Latin and the Catholic liturgy, creating from scratch a choir that could sing the divine offices. The beauty of their chanting, something utterly foreign and hauntingly beautiful in that setting, became his first tool for engagement, attracting the curiosity of the Khan himself. His dedication soon bore remarkable fruit. Within a few years, John of Montecorvino had not only built a church with a tall bell tower, a novel sight in the city, but he had also won the trust and tolerance of the Mongol Emperor, Timur Khan. He was granted permission to preach freely, a rare and precious concession. His most astounding linguistic achievement was the translation of the New Testament and the Psalms into the Mongolian language, a feat that required not just scholarly skill, but a deep immersion into the culture. He reported baptizing thousands, including a powerful Nestorian Ongut prince named George, who converted to Catholicism, bringing his entire tribe with him. By 1307, his efforts were formally recognized by the Pope in Avignon, who created the Archdiocese of Khanbalik and appointed John as its first archbishop, sending 7 fellow Franciscans to assist him. For a brief shining moment, it seemed a permanent bridgehead for Western Christianity had been established at the farthest end of the known world, and then the silence fell. This is the great mystery surrounding John's life work. He died around the year 1328 after nearly 3 decades of labor in China. The archdiocese he founded, however, did not long survive him. The friars who followed him were too few, and the political winds shifted dramatically. In 1368, the Mongol Yuan dynasty was overthrown by the native Ming dynasty, which was fiercely nationalist and suspicious of all foreign influences. The fledgling Catholic community, always a tiny minority dependent on Mongol tolerance, was cut off from its roots and withered away. Within a century of John's death, the church he built, the choir he trained, and the translated scriptures he labored over had vanished almost without a trace, swallowed by the vastness of China. So what are we to make of John of Montecorvino's solitary quest? His story is not one of lasting institutional success, but of profound individual impact. He proved that a single person, armed with nothing but faith, adaptability, and relentless patience, could embed himself at the heart of a mighty empire and earn the respect of its rulers. His letters were the most accurate descriptions of Mongol China to reach Europe in the early 14th century, yet they never captured the popular imagination like Marco Polo's more fantastical tales. He was a realist, not a romancer. His legacy is a poignant testament to the fragile nature of cultural bridges. He built a masterpiece of personal diplomacy and devotion, but it was a bridge that required constant, careful maintenance. Once he was gone and the political climate changed, the structure collapsed, leaving behind only his letters as a record of what one determined man could achieve, and how easily such achievements can be erased by the tides of history. While John of Montecorvino built bridges in the distant east, a traveler from the west was meticulously documenting the complex world right on Christianity's doorstep. In the year 1183, a secretary to the ruler of Granada named Ibn Jubair set out from his home in Al-Andalus to perform the Hajj, the sacred pilgrimage to Mecca. What began as a religious duty resulted in a travelogue of such sharp observation and literary grace that it became a classic of Arabic literature, offering us a Muslim scholar's eyewitness view of the Mediterranean at the height of the Crusades. His journey was a circuit of the sea itself, a loop that took him from Islamic Spain through Christian Sicily into the heart of Saladin's domains and back, all recorded with a poet's eye and a judge's discernment. Ibn Jubair's first major encounter with Latin Christian rule came not in the Holy Land, but on the island of Sicily. His ship, damaged in a storm, was forced to put in at the port of Messina, which was then under the control of the Norman King William II. For a devout Muslim from a sophisticated court culture, this was a profound culture shock, and his observations are priceless. He describes the Normans with a mixture of grudging respect and biting criticism. He is appalled by their taxation system, which he sees as naked extortion, and by the social status of pigs, animals considered unclean in Islam, which roamed freely and were protected by law. Yet he cannot help but admire their engineering, their bustling markets, and a surprising degree of religious tolerance for the time. He notes that Muslim artisans were employed in the royal workshops and that they were allowed to practice their faith, a pragmatism that contrasted sharply with the harsher realities he would later hear about in the Levant. His account of Sicily is a nuanced portrait of coexistence under Christian rule, fraught with inequality yet functioning, a snapshot of a medieval multicultural society that was already fading. After completing his pilgrimage in Mecca and Medina, Ibn Jubair's return route took him through the heart of the Muslim world, now united under a single legendary figure, Saladin. Traveling through Egypt and the Levant in the aftermath of Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem, Ibn Jubair portrays the Ayyubid Sultan as the ideal Muslim ruler, a stark contrast to the Normans. He writes effusively of the justice and security found in Saladin's lands, where a traveler could walk the roads without fear, and where the ruler's piety was evident in his support for scholars and the poor. This part of his riddler reads like a political endorsement, reinforcing the image of Saladin as a unifying hero for the Sunni Muslim world. For Ibn Jubair, the difference between the two realms was a matter of moral order, and his writing helped solidify the cultural memory of Saladin's era as a golden age of Islamic justice. Perhaps the most enduringly valuable parts of his journal, however, are his meticulous notes on the mechanics of travel itself. Ibn Jubair was a fascinated and often terrified passenger. He describes the general's merchant ships, the workhorses of the Mediterranean, in vivid detail, noting their massive size, their two-side rudders, and their reliance on a combination of sails and oars manned by Christian and Muslim rowers alike. He recounts the very real terrors of a winter crossing, the storms that could shatter masts, and the ever-present fear of shipwreck. He logs travel times between ports, the prices of passage, and the routines of life aboard a cramped vessel for weeks on end. This is not grand politics or theology. It is the granular reality of how people and ideas moved across the medieval sea. Through his eyes, we see the Mediterranean not as a barrier between Islam and Christendom, but as a connective, if dangerous, highway shared by both, a space where faith, commerce, and survival were inextricably linked on every voyage. A fantasy Nikitin's journey began with a simple commercial failure. In the year 1466, this merchant from the Russian city of Tver traveled south to the lands of the Shirvanshah in the Caucasus, hoping to trade his furs and other goods. Instead, his caravan was ambushed and robbed near the Caspian Sea, leaving him destitute and stranded far from home. Faced with ruin, Nikitin made a staggering decision. He would not slink back to Russia empty-handed. He would press forward, deeper into the unknown, to find a way to recoup his losses. This desperate gamble launched him on a 6-year odyssey that would take him across the Arabian Sea and into the heart of India, a land no Russian had ever documented before. His account, The Journey Beyond 3 Seas, named for the Caspian Sea, the Arabian Sea, and the Black Sea he crossed, is a raw, personal chronicle of survival and astonishment. Unlike the official reports of diplomats or the pious records of pilgrims, Nikitin's writing is the voice of a practical man trying to make sense of a world that defies all his expectations. He travels through the Muslim kingdoms of Persia, noting their customs and the constant political strife, before finally securing passage on a dhow bound for the Indian port of Chaul. From the moment he arrives, his narrative fills with a sense of profound dislocation. Here was an Orthodox Christian from the frozen forests of Russia, now walking through the humid, teeming markets of the Hindu world. His status was a constant source of tension and curiosity. He was a Zheng He, a foreigner, and his faith set him apart in a society divided between Muslim rulers and Hindu subjects. He writes with anguish about the struggle to maintain his religious practices in a land with no churches, where he could not observe the fasts or celebrate the holy days of the Orthodox calendar. He feared losing his faith entirely, a spiritual crisis that runs like a dark thread through his observations. Yet, this very outsider status made him an exceptionally sharp observer. With no agenda to convert or conquer, Nikitin simply documented what he saw with a merchant's eye for detail and value. He describes the bewildering diversity of Indian society, the strict caste system, and the vibrant bazaars overflowing with goods. He notes the price of horses, which were imported and extremely valuable, and the trade in spices, fabrics, and precious stones. His descriptions of the Deccan sultanates are filled with political intrigue, military parades, and the opulent, often brutal, lives of the rulers. But it is his notes on daily life and belief that are most captivating. He describes Hindu rituals with a mix of fascination and horror, writing about the devotion to cattle, the practice of sati where widows immolated themselves on their husbands' funeral pyres, and the colorful religious festivals. He records the clothing, the food, the architecture, and even the wildlife, giving one of the first European descriptions of monkeys and exotic birds. His account is not romantic, it is often gritty and homesick. He complains about the cost of living, the oppressive heat, and the loneliness of being a man without a country or a god he can openly worship. The great mystery of a fantasy Nikitin's tale surrounds its ending. After years in India, he began the long journey home, traveling back through Persia and reaching the Black Sea port of Kaffa, a Genos colony in Crimea. He writes of his relief and his intention to return to Tver, and then the record falls silent. Did he ever see the spires of his home city again? Some chronicles suggest he died in Smolensk before reaching Tver, while others imply he perished somewhere on the road. His manuscript, however, did make it home, copied and preserved in Russian monastic chronicles. His journey was an accident of commerce that became a milestone of cultural encounter. He was not a conqueror, a missionary, or an official explorer. He was a man who got lost, who kept walking, and who had the presence of mind to write down everything he saw. In doing so, he left behind a priceless, unvarnished portrait of 15th century India, seen through the weary, wondering eyes of a merchant who had traveled beyond 3 seas and found a world that would forever change him. Zhu Daguin's ship sailed up the Siem Reap River into a world of stone giants. In the year 1296, this Chinese diplomat arrived as part of a delegation from the Yuan dynasty to the court of the Khmer king, Indravarman III. He stayed for about a year, and the account he left behind, The Customs of Cambodia, is nothing short of a miracle. It is the only detailed eyewitness record of the Angkorian civilization at the absolute height of its power, a luminous snapshot of a society that would soon begin its slow fade into the jungle. Through his eyes, we do not just read about history, we walk its streets. Zhu Dogwen was a meticulous observer, and his descriptions pulse with life. He writes of the magnificent walled city of Angkor Thom, entered through gigantic stone gates topped by the serene, all-seeing face of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. He describes the wide causeways flanked by statues of gods and demons engaged in an eternal tug-of-war, a representation of the Hindu myth of churning the ocean of milk. At the city's heart stood the Bayon Temple, its towers carved with those immense enigmatic faces gazing toward the cardinal directions. Zhu Dogwen captures the awe this architecture inspired, but he also notes the practical details, the bustling markets, the system of canals, and the grand processions that filled the wide avenues. His account of the royal court is a masterpiece of ethnographic reporting. He describes the king emerging from his palace, bearing sacred swords, his head crowned with fragrant flowers. He notes the hierarchy of officials, the elephants caparisoned in gold, and the strict protocols that governed every movement. He writes with particular fascination about the palace women, numbering in the thousands, who lived in a separate, heavily guarded compound. His observations extend to the everyday lives of ordinary Khmers. He describes their homes raised on stilts, their clothing of simple cloth, their diets rich in fish and rice. He notes their legal system, their religious practices blending Hinduism and Buddhism, and even their superstitions. He tells us they brush their teeth with twigs and blacken their teeth with a lacquer, a custom he found strange. Of course, he dedicates awestruck passages to the temple complex of Angkor Wat, which he calls the Lu Zhu or Temple City. He describes its vast moat, its towering central spire representing Mount Meru, the home of the gods, and the breathtaking bas-reliefs that covered its walls, depicting epic battles and celestial dancers. He understood it as a funerary temple, a fact confirmed by modern archaeology. His text is so precise that for centuries it served as the primary guide for archaeologists reconstructing the social and urban fabric of Angkor. Without Zhu Dogwen, our understanding of this civilization would be based almost entirely on silent stones and fragmentary inscriptions. He gives the stones a voice, populating the majestic ruins with the laughter of market vendors, the chants of priests, and the rustle of silk in the royal court. Yet for all the light he sheds, his account also deepens the central mystery of Angkor. He describes a civilization at its peak, a well-organized, prosperous, and powerful empire. He makes no mention of crisis or decay, and yet, within a century and a half of his visit, Angkor will be abandoned as the political center of the Khmer world. The great reservoirs or barrays would silt up, the temples would be reclaimed by the voracious jungle, and the capital would shift to the region of Phnom Penh. Zhu Dogwen's very success in capturing a vibrant, functioning society makes its subsequent collapse even more puzzling. His text provides clues but not the answer. He notes the constant need to dredge the massive canals, hinting at the immense labor required to maintain Angkor's hydraulic empire. He describes wars with the neighboring Thai kingdoms of Sukhothai and Ayutthaya. Perhaps the combination of environmental strain, shifting trade routes, and military pressure created a perfect storm that the magnificent city could not weather. Zhu Dogwen gives us the what and the how of Angkor's golden age in exquisite detail, but the why of its end remains whispered only by the roots of the strangler figs that now grip its towers. His report is a gift and a riddle, a perfectly preserved moment that makes the silence that followed all the more profound. Pero Tafur did not travel for God or for gold. This young Spanish nobleman left his home in Cordoba in 1435 for a reason that seems almost whimsical to us now: simple curiosity and a thirst for adventure. For 4 years he wandered across Europe and the Mediterranean, a knight-errant with a pen, and the account he left behind is a uniquely personal and often brutally honest portrait of a world that was about to vanish forever. His journey was not a pilgrimage, though he visited holy sites. It was not a trade mission, though he observed economies. It was the grand tour of a restless aristocrat, and his sharp eyes captured the fading grandeur and rising tensions of the 15th century. One of his most significant stops was Constantinople, which he reached in 1437. The great capital of the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former glory, a city depopulated and decaying, its mighty walls enclosing more ruins than riches. Tafur secured an audience with the emperor himself, John VIII Palaiologos. He described the court ceremonies which still clung to ancient ritual, but he noted the palpable anxiety and poverty that hung over the proceedings. The emperor, he wrote, had to pawn the crown jewels to pay for his expenses. Taffer saw what others missed, the desperate fragility behind the imperial pageantry. He sensed the city was living on borrowed time, and he was right. He stood in the Hagia Sophia, still a Christian cathedral, just 16 years before it would be converted into a mosque. His description is one of the last by a Western traveler of that sacred space in its original state, a fleeting glimpse of a world on the precipice. From Constantinople, Taffer's wanderlust took him south. He sailed to Egypt, then under the Mamluk Sultanate, and traveled to the Holy Land. Everywhere he went, he judged what he saw with the critical eye of a European noble. He was dismissive of what he considered Egyptian indolence, shocked by the markets where enslaved people were sold, and unimpressed by the hospitality he received, which he found lacking compared to Spanish standards. In Jerusalem, he performed the rituals of a pilgrim, but his account lacks the pious fervor of a sea-wolf. For Taffer, it was another experience to be catalogued, another set of customs to be analyzed and often criticized. This is what makes his travelogue so valuable. He was not trying to inspire crusaders or convert souls. He was simply giving his opinion, and his opinions were frequently caustic, arrogant, and revealing. He complained about bad roads, dishonest guides, and uncomfortable lodgings with the air of a disgruntled tourist. He compared military tactics, architectural styles, and the quality of horses wherever he went, always finding the European way superior. Yet within this critical frame, he delivered astonishing details. He described the pyramids, the Nile's irrigation systems, and the bustling spice markets with a merchant's eye for scale and value. He recorded political gossip, the cost of goods, and the state of fortifications. His narrative is like a series of candid snapshots, unedited and unflattering, showing us the medieval Mediterranean not as a land of marvels, but as a real, often grubby and deeply troubled place. He returned to Spain in 1439, his curiosity satisfied, his adventures complete. He wrote his memoirs not for publication, but as a personal record. In them we find no grand prophecy about the fall of Constantinople, though he witnessed its weakness, no sweeping analysis of the rise of the Ottomans. Just the observations of a well-traveled man who had seen the old order cracking at its seams. Taffer's importance lies precisely in this lack of agenda. He was a witness, not a prophet. His sharp, skeptical voice cuts through the legends and religious fervor that color so many other medieval travel accounts, giving us something arguably more precious, a clear-eyed, if biased, look at the everyday reality of a world trembling on the edge of the modern age. The world of Taffer was one of fading empires and cynical observation, but another man of the same century looked east with a gaze of pure, unwavering faith. Jordanes Catalani was a Dominican friar from the region of Catalonia, and his mission was not to tour or to trade, but to save souls in a land of bewildering difference. In the early 1300s, he was sent by the Pope to the Malabar coast of India, a region already home to ancient Christian communities who traced their faith back to the Apostle Thomas. Jordanes' task was to minister to these St. Thomas Christians and to bring them more firmly under the authority of Rome, a delicate diplomatic and spiritual undertaking in a Hindu and Muslim land. He would eventually become the first bishop of Quilon, a historic appointment, but his true legacy is the book he wrote, the Mirabilia Descripta, or the Description of Wonders. This text is a fascinating paradox, a blend of careful missionary report and a medieval mind struggling to categorize the utterly unfamiliar. His letters and book reveal the immense challenges of his mission. India was not a spiritual vacuum waiting for his message. It was a dense, thriving civilization with its own deep-rooted beliefs. He writes of the difficulty in communicating across language barriers, of the hostility from local rulers wary of foreign influence, and of the constant, grinding hardship of life in a tropical climate for a European accustomed to temperate seasons. Most poignantly, he documents the martyrdom of his fellow friars. In one harrowing account, he describes how 4 of his Dominican brothers were captured, tortured, and killed for preaching in territory controlled by a Muslim ruler. Jordanes recounts their steadfast faith in the face of death, framing their sacrifice as a seed for the future church. but his writing cannot hide the visceral fear and loss that accompanied such evangelical work. This was not the glorious conquest of legend, it was a painful, often lonely struggle on the very frontiers of Christendom. Yet for all its sobering realities, the Mirabilia Descripta truly earns its name in its descriptions of India itself. Jordanes was a diligent observer, and he recorded what he saw with a scholar's eye, even when his interpretations were filtered through a medieval worldview. He provides one of the earliest European accounts of Indian wildlife, describing elephants with a mix of awe and practical detail, noting their strength, their use in war, and the method of capturing them. He writes of coconuts, explaining how the tree provided water, milk, oil, and fiber, a wonder of natural utility. He describes the social structures, noting the caste system and the distinct roles of different communities, from warriors to merchants. But then the wonder takes over. He reports on trees that produce wool, a likely reference to cotton that became fantastical in the telling. He speaks of giant serpents and men with dog heads, tales that seem borrowed from the same legendary stock as Manville. This blending is the key to understanding his work. For Jordanes, the divine and the natural were inextricably linked. A truly massive elephant or a tree that gave drink, food, and cloth was not just a biological fact, it was a testament to God's creative power, a mirabilia meant to inspire pious wonder in his European readers. His exaggerations were not necessarily lies, but amplifications meant to convey the overwhelming otherness of the world he had entered. So, what are we to make of Bishop Jordanes Catalani? He was a man caught between two roles, a church administrator trying to build a diocese on shaky ground, and an accidental ethnographer trying to document a world that constantly challenged his categories. His mission ultimately had limited success. The St. Thomas Christians largely maintained their ancient traditions, but his book, with all its flawed marvels, served a crucial purpose. It added another layer, however distorted, to Europe's growing picture of India. It was a report from the front lines of faith, where belief was tested by strangeness and confirmed by sacrifice, a reminder that exploration in the Middle Ages was often measured not in miles charted, but in the fragile bridges of understanding attempted and sometimes lost between vastly different worlds. A royal embassy of the early 15th century traveled not toward the rising sun, but toward a rising storm. In 1403, King Henry III of Castile dispatched his chamberlain, Ruy González de Clavijo, on a mission of staggering ambition and danger. The goal was to reach the court of the most feared conqueror on earth, Timur the Lame, known to the west as Tamerlane, in his legendary capital of Samarkand. This was not a journey of trade or pilgrimage, but a desperate diplomatic gambit. The Ottoman Turks were pressing hard against Christian Europe, and King Henry, like many Western rulers, clutched at a strategic hope. Perhaps the mighty Timur, a Muslim himself but a fierce rival of the Ottoman Sultan, could be persuaded to become an ally or at least a distraction, opening a second front in the east. Clavijo's mission was to deliver gifts, letters, and this fragile proposal across thousands of miles of hostile and unknown terrain. The journey itself was an epic of endurance and negotiation. Sailing from Spain to Constantinople, Clavijo and his small party then traveled overland through the fracturing Byzantine Empire and into the tumultuous realms of Anatolia and Persia. Every step required new permissions, new guides, and new strategies for survival. They navigated a patchwork of petty kingdoms and Timurid governors, never certain if they would be received as honored envoys or taken as prisoners. Clavijo's meticulous chronicle of this trek is a masterclass in medieval travel logistics, filled with notes on crumbling fortresses, uncertain loyalties, and the sheer physical toll of crossing mountain passes and deserts. It was a journey through a world still trembling from Timur's own devastating campaigns, a landscape where the scars of recent conquest were everywhere visible. After more than a year of travel, they finally arrived at their destination, and the sight that greeted them defied all European expectation. Samarkand was not a barbarian camp, but a city of breathtaking, calculated splendor. Timur was using the wealth plundered from across Asia to build a capital that would proclaim his glory. Clavijo described vast gardens, ornate palaces, and bustling markets filled with goods from India, China, and Persia. He wrote of a great mosque with a portal so high it dwarfed every building in Seville, and of streets laid out in orderly grids, a deliberate display of imperial control. The city was a living museum of Timur's conquests, populated by the finest artisans, scholars, and craftsmen forcibly relocated from Damascus, Baghdad, and Delhi. This was not mere opulence, it was power expressed in stone, tile, and social engineering. The heart of this spectacle, however, was the court of Timur himself. Clavijo's audience with the aging conqueror is one of the most vivid set pieces in medieval travel literature. He describes a ceremony of overwhelming scale and rigid hierarchy. Envoys from Egypt, China, and the steppes were all present, each waiting for their moment in a carefully orchestrated theater of submission. When Clavijo was finally led before Timur, he found not a monster, but a frail, white-bearded man seated on a low dais, yet whose presence commanded absolute terror and respect. The gifts from Castile were presented, and Timur inquired through interpreters about the King of Spain, the state of his lands, and the strength of his enemies. The atmosphere was one of intense, precarious scrutiny. Every word, every gesture was weighed for its meaning and its potential value. Clavijo witnessed feasts for thousands in pavilions of silk and military reviews showcasing endless ranks of cavalry. He understood that he was witnessing the machinery of an empire built on swift, overwhelming force and a cult of personality that demanded awe. Politically, the mission achieved little in the end. Timur was interested in the Spanish king as a potential tributary, not an equal ally. He died just months after Clavijo's departure in 1405, and his empire rapidly fractured, dashing any hope of a lasting anti-Ottoman pact. Yet Clavijo's true success was his pen, not his diplomacy. He returned to Castile and composed a detailed, sober report that cut through the mythical fog surrounding the East. His was not a tale of dog-headed men or Christian kings, but a clear-eyed administrative and military assessment of a real superpower. He described its strengths, its vulnerabilities, and its awe-inspiring central authority. In doing so, Ruy González de Clavijo provided Europe with one of its last and most precise portraits of the medieval world order in Central Asia, a snapshot taken at the very moment before the rise of the gunpowder empires and the sea routes of the Portuguese would forever change the map of global power. His journey was a final, brilliant flash of late medieval statecraft, an attempt to navigate by the old stars of land-based empires, even as the age of ocean-going exploration was dawning over the horizon. 5 years after Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean, a different kind of dreamer set sail from the English port of Bristol. His name was Giovanni Caboto, though history remembers him as John Cabot, a Venetian navigator with a map in his mind that pointed not southwest, but straight into the cold, gray heart of the North Atlantic. He carried with him a theory, one that would bridge the fading medieval world and the dawning age of empires. While Spain pursued a southern route to the Indies, Cabot was convinced that a shorter, faster passage lay to the north, across the top of the world. He argued that the spherical Earth must have a shorter circumference at higher latitudes, a logical but flawed piece of medieval geography that promised a direct gateway to the riches of Cathay. This intellectual gamble won him a patent from King Henry VII of England, a document that offered royal permission but no royal money. The true backers of his daring venture were the merchants of Bristol, men whose fortunes were built on the North Atlantic trade in fish and Icelandic cod. They were pragmatic, not romantic, and they saw in Cabot's plan not just spice, but something more immediately valuable, new fishing grounds of unimaginable scale. In the spring of 1497, with a single small ship named the Matthew and a crew of just 18 men, Cabot ventured into the same treacherous waters the Norse had crossed 5 centuries earlier. His voyage was swift, taking only about 35 days before the lookout shouted of land. What he saw was not a tropical paradise, but a rugged, forested coastline, likely the rocky shores of Newfoundland or Cape Breton Island. He went ashore briefly, planting the banners of England and Venice, claiming the territory for his king and his own city-state. He saw no people, but he noted signs of human habitation, a snare for game and a carved stick, evidence he was not the first to walk there. Most importantly to his Bristol sponsors, he reported seas so thick with cod that you could lower a basket over the side and haul it up full of fish. He had not found the silk and jewels of the Great Khan, but he had discovered a continental shelf teeming with biological gold, the foundation of a North Atlantic economy that would last for centuries. He returned to Bristol a hero, received a cash reward from the king, and began immediately planning a second, far grander expedition. This is where the clear record ends and the enduring mystery begins. In May of 1498, John Cabot departed Bristol once more, this time with a fleet of 5 ships. Their goal was to follow the coastline he had found, to sail south and west until they reached the island of Cipangu, or Japan. The fleet sailed into the Atlantic mists and vanished. Not a single ship, not a single logbook, not a single survivor ever returned. The fate of John Cabot and his men is one of history's great silent chapters. Did they sink in a sudden North Atlantic storm, those waters known for their violent, unpredictable fury? Did they push further south, perhaps reaching the coast of what would become New England, only to meet disaster there, or in a darker twist suggested by a single cryptic letter from a London merchant a few years later, did some of the ships mutiny, turning back early and leaving Cabot's own vessel to press on alone into oblivion? We simply do not know. The ocean kept its secret, yet his legacy was anything but lost. Though his body and his ships were gone, his claim remained. That simple act of planting a flag, backed by the Bristol merchant's subsequent exploitation of the Grand Banks cod fisheries, laid the foundational stone for England's eventual colonial empire in North America. His voyage proved that a continent stood in the way of Asia, and it reopened the Norse corridor across the North Atlantic under a new national flag. John Cabot stands at the precise pivot point between eras. He was a medieval thinker using Ptolemaic logic to chart his course, but his actions and his failure helped catalyze the modern world of transatlantic rivalry and settlement. He sought a route to the ancient wealth of the East, but his true discovery was the vast, waiting potential of the West, a promise his own vanished fleet would never live to see fulfilled. The vanishing of John Cabot's fleet is a stark reminder of the ocean's indifference, but a new kind of explorer was already at work on the shores of Portugal, one who understood that to conquer the sea, you must first master it from dry land. Our final figure never commanded a ship on a voyage of discovery. He was a prince who rarely left his own country, yet his vision charted the course for the entire modern world. He was Prince Henry of Portugal, known to history as Henry the Navigator, and his true exploration was a methodical campaign against the unknown itself. From his windswept headquarters at Sagres on the southwestern tip of Europe, Henry transformed exploration from a matter of individual daring into a coordinated, state-funded science. He gathered the best minds he could find, not just sailors but cartographers, astronomers, shipwrights, and mathematicians. Jewish scholars, Arab geographers, and Italian merchants all contributed to what became, in essence, the world's first dedicated institute for oceanic research. This was no longer about a single captain's luck or a merchant's gamble. This was a systematic project of discovery, driven by a prince's patience and a nation's ambition. Henry's captains were his instruments, sent south year after year to push a little further down the intimidating coast of West Africa, a shoreline European sailors had feared for centuries as the Green Sea of Darkness. Each voyage had a specific mission: to map a new stretch of coast, to record currents and winds, to test new ship designs like the agile caravel, and to seek answers to 3 great medieval mysteries. The first was economic. Where was the source of the immense gold that crossed the Sahara, enriching Muslim empires to the north? The second was strategic. How far south did the lands of Islam actually extend? And the third was the most potent legend of all. Was the kingdom of the Christian priest King Prester John actually reachable by sailing around Africa? These were not vague hopes, they were research questions. Under Henry's direction, each returning captain's log was scrutinized, each new headland was added to the evolving map, and each failure informed the next attempt. The progress was slow, sometimes agonizingly so, but it was relentless. His sailors eventually passed Cape Bojador in 1434, a psychological barrier feared for generations. They reached the Senegal River and the lush coasts of what they called Guinea, establishing direct trade for gold, ivory, and tragically enslaved people, a dark turn that would stain the coming age. They discovered the Azores and Madeira Islands, proving the value of Atlantic exploration. Henry himself died in 1460, decades before his countrymen would finally round the Cape of Good Hope and reach the Indian Ocean. He never saw the ultimate answers to his questions, yet his legacy is the very blueprint for the age of discovery. By making exploration a sustained national project, he provided the model that Spain, England, and France would soon follow. He replaced superstition with careful record-keeping and isolated adventure with institutional knowledge. The great explorers who came after, from Dias to da Gama to Columbus, sailed in his wake, beneficiaries of the school of thought he built on that lonely Portuguese promontory. So we end our journey not with a lone wanderer in a distant land, but with an architect in a study, staring at a map filled with cautious lines and vast, inviting blanks. Prince Henry the Navigator understood that the greatest mystery was not a place, but a process. The true discovery was learning how to discover. From the frozen shores of Vinland to the bustling ports of the Indian Ocean, we have walked alongside 30 souls who dared to step off the map. Their stories form a single sprawling tapestry, woven from threads of hard fact, tantalizing mystery, and outright legend. This is the true portrait of the medieval world, not as a static collection of kingdoms, but as a living, breathing network of human movement. It was a world where a monk from Beijing could debate theology with a French king, where a Moroccan scholar could serve as a judge in both Delhi and the Maldives, and where a shipwrecked Russian merchant could document the wonders of India. These were not just journeys of geography, but expeditions into the very nature of belief, identity, and human connection. They remind us with startling clarity that the borders we draw between cultures and continents are often far more porous than our history books suggest. The greatest adventures of history are never just about the destinations reached, but about the vast, uncharted spaces in between, the moments of misunderstanding, wonder, and fragile contact that truly redefine a world. So as our own map of this era now feels complete, the mysteries these explorers left behind only grow more compelling. Which of their tales captivated you the most? Was it the stoic determination of John of Montecorvino in Beijing, or the accidental discovery of Bjarni Herjolfsson? Do you believe there are still lost journals waiting in an archive, or the faint trace of an undiscovered route hidden in some forgotten text? The search for their full stories is, in itself, a form of exploration. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this journey through the map of the medieval mind, be sure to subscribe for more adventures into the mysteries of the past.